He came home from war thinking the fight was over, but on a frozen night, strangers marked his land as empty. They didn't know a seal was inside. They didn't see the dog watching in silence. When greed crossed the fence, faith was tested. Betrayal came from the one he trusted most. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of restraint, faith, and God's quiet miracles. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses against the outskirts of Spokane, where a lone cabin stands between forest and silence, snow erasing roads, memories, and the thin line between peace and war. The first night back was always the worst, not because of the cold. Ethan Walker had learned long ago how to live inside cold, but because of the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt alert, like it was waiting to see what he would do next. The cabin sat half buried in snow, timber groaning softly as the wind pushed through the trees, and Ethan stood just inside the door, longer than necessary, letting the stillness size him up the way he used to size up rooms overseas. No voices, no radios, no distant machinery of war, just wind, wood, and breath. He told himself this was leave, a pause, a temporary return. The word temporary used to bring comfort. Now it felt like a lie he repeated out of habit. He moved through the cabin with restrained efficiency, touching familiar surfaces only when he had to. The stove was cold, the table bare, the narrow window facing the tree line dark as ink. He didn't sit. Sitting invited thought, and thought invited memory. Standing kept him functional. Rex followed at his side without sound, not pacing, not anxious. Simply present, like a shadow that chose loyalty over fear. Ethan didn't look down, but he felt the dog's awareness, sharp and coiled. Rex wasn't asking for reassurance. Rex was offering it. That quiet confidence steadied Ethan more than he wanted to admit. "So," Ethan murmured, voice barely shaping the air, "we're back." The words felt wrong the moment he said them. Back implied continuity, as if nothing had fractured in the time between departure and return, as if war could be stepped out of and folded away. Outside, the wind shifted, snow brushing the cabin walls in slow, patient strokes. Ethan's mind counted the seconds between gusts without permission. He hated that reflex, hated more that it still worked. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, letting the simple routine anchor him. Heat would come, steam would rise, proof that something in this place still obeyed basic rules. Rex froze. Not a growl, not a bark, just stillness, absolute, deliberate. His body angled toward the window, breath shallow, listening with more than ears. Ethan followed Rex's attention and saw nothing at first, only the layered darkness of trees and falling snow. Then movement resolved itself, subtle but wrong, shapes drifting near the fence line, careful and unhurried. They didn't stumble like lost hikers or announce themselves like neighbors. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they owned the night. Clarity settled into Ethan's chest, cold and precise. He stepped closer to the window, but stayed out of the interior light, letting his reflection dissolve into the glass. Outside, one man crouched and pressed a thin marker into the frozen ground. Another paced, counting steps. Third laughed quietly and spoke about paperwork, about how the land was empty, about how easy it would be to make it official. Empty. The word struck harder than it should have. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had heard the rumors before he came back, stories about a real estate company buying silence, declaring properties abandoned, erasing names from records as easily as crossing out a line. People moved. Sometimes people disappeared. He had told himself Spokane was only a place to sleep, that the cabin was temporary, that none of this was his responsibility. But the men outside didn't know that, and worse, they didn't care. Rex shifted, a low sound beginning deep in his chest. Ethan dropped to one knee and rested a hand lightly against the dog's neck, not holding him down, just grounding him. "Quiet," he whispered. Rex obeyed instantly, lowering into the shadows, eyes fixed on the intruders. The tension in him was palpable, not fear, but readiness. Rex understood this moment in a way words never could. Ethan forced his breathing into rhythm. This wasn't a fight. Not yet. He watched instead, cataloging details without emotion. How the men tested fence posts, how one studied the cabin roof as if already imagining forged documents, how casually they spoke about erasing a place from existence. The kettle began to hiss behind him, the sound too loud in the tight space. Ethan turned the stove off and let the room cool again. Heat made windows glow. Glow drew attention. For a brief, unwelcome moment, another place intruded on his thoughts. A compound marked clear, a doorway that should have been empty, a decision made by someone far away. He shut it down immediately. This wasn't there. This was here. The men eventually retreated, satisfied with their measurements and assumptions. Their footprints cut clean lines through the snow until the wind began to soften them, already rewriting the night. When the forest returned to its slow, breathing quiet, Ethan didn't move. Minutes passed. Rex remained beside him, unwavering. Only when the silence settled fully did Ethan exhale, his body loosening just enough to feel the ache he'd been carrying since crossing back into the state. "They think nobody's home," he said quietly, more observation than complaint. Rex's ears flicked, acknowledging the truth without judgment. Ethan finally sat at the small table, hands resting flat against the wood. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from restraint, from everything he had chosen not to do. He stared at the blank wall and considered leaving, letting someone else deal with it, letting the land become a line item in someone else's ledger. The thought lasted only seconds. He had seen what happened when predators learned no one would push back. He closed his eyes, forearms braced against the table, and felt the war press in from memory, demanding relevance, demanding continuation. He shook his head once, sharply. No, this wasn't about becoming who he used to be. It was about refusing to become something worse. Rex rose and pressed his head against Ethan's knee, solid and warm. Ethan rested his hand there, feeling the steady life beneath it. Whatever was coming wouldn't begin tonight, but it had already been set in motion. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that offered no comfort, that silence would not protect this place. Only choice would. Winter presses against the outskirts of Spokane, where a lone cabin stands between forest and silence, snow erasing roads, memories, and the thin line between peace and war. The first night back was always the worst, not because of the cold. Ethan Walker had learned long ago how to live inside cold, but because of the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt alert, like it was waiting to see what he would do next. The cabin sat half buried in snow, timber groaning softly as the wind pushed through the trees, and Ethan stood just inside the door, longer than necessary, letting the stillness size him up the way he used to size up rooms overseas. No voices, no radios, no distant machinery of war, just wind, wood, and breath. He told himself this was leave, a pause, a temporary return. The word temporary used to bring comfort. Now it felt like a lie he repeated out of habit. He moved through the cabin with restrained efficiency, touching familiar surfaces only when he had to. The stove was cold, the table bare, the narrow window facing the tree line dark as ink. He didn't sit. Sitting invited thought, and thought invited memory. Standing kept him functional. Rex followed at his side without sound, not pacing, not anxious. Simply present, like a shadow that chose loyalty over fear. Ethan didn't look down, but he felt the dog's awareness, sharp and coiled. Rex wasn't asking for reassurance. Rex was offering it. That quiet confidence steadied Ethan more than he wanted to admit. "So," Ethan murmured, voice barely shaping the air, "we're back." The words felt wrong the moment he said them. Back implied continuity, as if nothing had fractured in the time between departure and return, as if war could be stepped out of and folded away. Outside, the wind shifted, snow brushing the cabin walls in slow, patient strokes. Ethan's mind counted the seconds between gusts without permission. He hated that reflex, hated more that it still worked. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, letting the simple routine anchor him. Heat would come, steam would rise, proof that something in this place still obeyed basic rules. Rex froze. Not a growl, not a bark, just stillness, absolute, deliberate. His body angled toward the window, breath shallow, listening with more than ears. Ethan followed Rex's attention and saw nothing at first, only the layered darkness of trees and falling snow. Then movement resolved itself, subtle but wrong. Shapes drifting near the fence line, careful and unhurried. They didn't stumble like lost hikers or announce themselves like neighbors. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they owned the night. Clarity settled into Ethan's chest, cold and precise. He stepped closer to the window, but stayed out of the interior light, letting his reflection dissolve into the glass. Outside, one man crouched and pressed a thin marker into the frozen ground. Another paced, counting steps. Third laughed quietly and spoke about paperwork, about how the land was empty, about how easy it would be to make it official. Empty. The word struck harder than it should have. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He had heard the rumors before he came back, stories about a real estate company buying silence, declaring properties abandoned, erasing names from records as easily as crossing out a line. People moved. Sometimes people disappeared. He had told himself Spokane was only a place to sleep, that the cabin was temporary, that none of this was his responsibility. But the men outside didn't know that, and worse, they didn't care. Rex shifted, a low sound beginning deep in his chest. Ethan dropped to one knee and rested a hand lightly against the dog's neck, not holding him down, just grounding him. "Quiet," he whispered. Rex obeyed instantly, lowering into the shadows, eyes fixed on the intruders. The tension in him was palpable, not fear, but readiness. Rex understood this moment in a way words never could. Ethan forced his breathing into rhythm. This wasn't a fight. Not yet. He watched instead, cataloging details without emotion. How the men tested fence posts. How one studied the cabin roof as if already imagining forged documents. How casually they spoke about erasing a place from existence. The kettle began to hiss behind him, the sound too loud in the tight space. Ethan turned the stove off and let the room cool again. Heat made windows glow. Glow drew attention. For a brief, unwelcome moment, another place intruded on his thoughts. A compound marked clear, a doorway that should have been empty, a decision made by someone far away. He shut it down immediately. This wasn't there. This was here. The men eventually retreated, satisfied with their measurements and assumptions. Their footprints cut clean lines through the snow until the wind began to soften them, already rewriting the night. When the forest returned to its slow, breathing quiet, Ethan didn't move. Minutes passed. Rex remained beside him, unwavering. Only when the silence settled fully did Ethan exhale, his body loosening just enough to feel the ache he'd been carrying since crossing back into the state. "They think nobody's home," he said quietly, more observation than complaint. Rex's ears flicked, acknowledging the truth without judgment. Ethan finally sat at the small table, hands resting flat against the wood. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from restraint, from everything he had chosen not to do. He stared at the blank wall and considered leaving, letting someone else deal with it, letting the land become a line item in someone else's ledger. The thought lasted only seconds. He had seen what happened when predators learned no one would push back. He closed his eyes, forearms braced against the table, and felt the war press in from memory, demanding relevance, demanding continuation. He shook his head once, sharply. No, this wasn't about becoming who he used to be. It was about refusing to become something worse. Rex rose and pressed his head against Ethan's knee, solid and warm. Ethan rested his hand there, feeling the steady life beneath it. Whatever was coming wouldn't begin tonight, but it had already been set in motion. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that offered no comfort, that silence would not protect this place. Only choice would. Morning thins the storm into pale light over Spokane. Ethan leaves the cabin behind, drives toward town, and carries the uneasy knowledge that someone measured his home last night and will return with certainty. Ethan kept the heater low and the lights off, as if the cabin could betray him by glowing. And when he stepped outside, the air felt sharper than the night before, cleaner in a way that made him distrust it. Fresh snow covered the tracks the men had left, but it didn't erase the feeling of being watched. It only disguised it, like a wound dressed too quickly. Rex moved at Ethan's side with a quiet, vigilant focus that steadied Ethan's breathing without fixing the knot in his chest. Ethan told himself the drive into Spokane was practical, that he needed supplies, that he needed to confirm what the rumor mill had already whispered about the company swallowing land. But he also knew there was another reason he wouldn't say out loud. Ethan needed to see people moving through ordinary life, needed to test whether he could still exist among them without the war leaking out of his eyes. The road was half buried, the trees heavy with snow, and every bend in the asphalt reminded Ethan how easy it would be for a vehicle to appear in the mirror and follow without effort. He scanned anyway, hating himself for scanning, hating himself more for being relieved when the mirror stayed empty. Spokane rose out of the white like a place pretending winter was only decoration. Storefronts glowed, holiday lights clung to awnings, and the sidewalks held footprints that looked careless compared to the disciplined marks he had watched at his fence. Ethan parked away from the busiest stretch and kept his movements plain, shoulders slightly rounded, head down, as if anonymity could be worn like another layer. It almost worked until he passed a television in a diner window and saw his own face flash for half a second in a looping news segment that had never truly died, because hero stories and death stories were hard to let go of. The caption was old, but the image was sharp enough to punch air from his lungs. A younger Ethan in desert dust, a headline about a lone operator and a destroyed terrorist flotilla, a final line that declared him missing and presumed dead. Spokane had believed that ending. Belief was convenient. It allowed people to admire a ghost without dealing with the mess of a living man. Ethan felt the strange pull of it, the temptation to let the lie keep protecting him, to remain a rumor instead of a person who could be cornered with questions. He moved past the window before the clip looped again, but it followed him anyway, flickering behind his eyes like a flare that wouldn't extinguish. Inside the small grocery, he chose only what he needed and nothing that suggested permanence. His hands moved quickly, but his mind moved slower, drifting back to the night he disappeared from the public story. He remembered the heat, the salt in his mouth, the moment the mission turned from precision into chaos, the way radio chatter had collapsed into broken syllables. He remembered the decision to go forward alone because no one else could, because sometimes the cleanest way to save lives was to make yourself the only target. He remembered the aftermath more than the fight, the silence after, the bodies counted, the cameras that caught only the ending, not the hours of fear and restraint that preceded it. After that, a bureaucratic machine had tried to place him into categories that made sense on paper, and when it couldn't, it had done what systems often did with inconvenient survivors. It had allowed the world to assume he was gone. Ethan had accepted the disappearance because it felt like relief, because it meant fewer salutes, fewer speeches, fewer people trying to borrow his pain for their inspiration. Today, seeing it replayed in a window, he felt something like grief for the version of himself that the country had turned into a symbol, and something like resentment that the symbol had a cleaner life than he did. Rex waited near the entrance, eyes tracking movement with calm intensity, and Ethan noticed how people looked at the dog with easy affection while never quite looking at Ethan long enough to recognize him. It made Ethan feel both safer and lonelier. He paid in cash and left, but the air outside carried a shift, a subtle tightening as if the town had sensed an old story walking among it. He told himself he was imagining it, until a voice said his name softly from behind him, not loud enough for others to hear, but precise enough to stop his feet. "Ethan!" He didn't turn right away. He let the sound settle, tested it against memory, and felt his chest compress. When he turned, he saw Martha Reed standing a few steps away with a bag in her hand and a child's mitten clipped to the strap, and the sight hit him with a force that was not violence, but something more destabilizing: time. Martha's eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying grief, while still having to buy groceries and pay bills and keep a child warm, and Ethan hated himself for noticing it because noticing meant caring, and caring meant the world could get under his armor again. Martha didn't move closer at first. Martha didn't ask how he was alive. Martha didn't cry in the street. Martha simply looked at him, as if confirming he was real, as if the town's belief in his death had been a blanket she'd been forced to wear, and she was finally allowed to breathe. Ethan tried to speak and found his throat tight, his words stuck behind all the things he couldn't say, that he'd thought about her in foreign nights, that he'd told himself coming home would be easier if he didn't look back, that he'd never imagined she would be standing here holding the shape of a new life he wasn't part of. "I didn't want anyone to know," he managed, and the sentence sounded weak, even to him. Martha's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something like a painful understanding. "They said you were gone," Martha replied, and Ethan heard the weight in the word "they." Not just the news, not just the town, the whole machine of certainty that had swept him into legend and left others to mourn. Ethan's mind moved fast, trying to assemble the safe path out of the moment, but Rex's quiet presence beside him reminded him that running was not always the same as surviving. Martha glanced at Rex and then back at Ethan. "I'm not here to expose you," Martha said. "I'm here because they're coming for you." Ethan felt the night at the fence flare in his mind, the measured footsteps, the laughter about empty land. Martha's grip tightened on the bag. "My husband tried to say no," Martha continued, voice low and steady, like someone reciting a fact that had been carved into her. "He wouldn't sign, he wouldn't leave. They made it look like an accident, and everybody learned how to stay quiet after that." The child's mitten swung slightly as she spoke, a small, innocent detail that made Ethan's stomach twist because it proved what the violence had bought: a widow and a child learning fear as a language. Ethan's hands clenched, then relaxed, then clenched again. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but the most dangerous one sat at the center. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" And the answer arrived before he asked it, because he was dead to the world, and the dead didn't protect anyone. Martha took a breath, and when she spoke again, her words opened a darker door. "It isn't just land," Martha said. "People disappear, girls from the edge of town, men who complain too loudly. They move them through properties they control. If someone asks, the paperwork says the place was abandoned." Ethan felt cold spread under his skin that had nothing to do with winter. He understood now why the men last night had sounded so casual. The casualness belonged to a system that had been practiced, polished, repeated until cruelty felt routine. Martha watched him carefully, as if gauging whether he would retreat into himself or step forward into consequence. Ethan looked at the street, the ordinary passers-by, the holiday lights, and felt the absurdity of it. This town dressed itself in celebration, while rot moved underneath like a hidden infection. He forced his voice to stay even. "Don't follow me," Ethan said, because warning was the only kindness he could offer without making promises he might not be able to keep. Martha's expression hardened with a familiarity that told Ethan she had been living in warning for too long. "I'm coming to your cabin," Martha replied, "not to beg, not to trap you, to tell you what I know where no one listens." Ethan started to object, but Rex shifted slightly, a silent reminder that danger had already found them, whether Ethan welcomed it or not. Martha stepped back, as if ending the conversation before it could become visible, and then added one last thing, the detail that made Ethan's spine go rigid. "They think your place is empty," Martha said, "but last night they weren't just measuring land, they were learning your silence." Ethan watched her walk away, the mitten swinging, the bag held close, and the ache in his chest sharpened into something that resembled purpose and dread braided together. He got into his vehicle and drove back toward the cabin with Rex beside him, and every mile felt like a decision he couldn't undo. In his mind, he replayed the men's movements at the fence, but now he layered Martha's words over them, and the picture darkened. By the time the cabin came into view, he already knew the day would not end cleanly. He parked, scanned the tree line, and listened as Rex listened, both of them sensing that the winter wasn't merely cold, it was crowded. Inside, Ethan set the groceries down without unpacking, and the silence that had felt like a refuge last night now felt like a stage waiting for actors. When the first faint crunch of tires on snow drifted up the road, too early for night, too deliberate for a neighbor, Ethan's pulse stayed steady, but his thoughts tightened because he understood what Martha meant. The next knock would not be friendly, and it would not be accidental. Snow loosens its grip over Spokane's outskirts while power gathers elsewhere, in warm rooms and quiet offices where men decide the fate of land they never walk and lives they never see. The meeting took place far from the forest and the cabin, in a building designed to feel temporary and permanent at the same time, glass and steel arranged to suggest movement while ensuring control. The man at the head of the table listened more than he spoke, fingers resting lightly on a folder that held maps, permits, and signatures that were real enough to pass and false enough to erase someone's home. He did not need to raise his voice. He had learned long ago that fear responded better to calm. Reports came in clipped phrases delivered by men who understood that hesitation was weakness and enthusiasm was suspicious. One spoke about a property near the Spokane line that had been flagged as empty. Another mentioned unusual security markers found overnight. A third dismissed the concern with a shrug and a reminder that land did not resist. People did, and people could be handled. The man smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. He had built his business on predictability, on the certainty that paperwork could move faster than protest, and that silence could be purchased cheaper than compliance. He had also learned to respect anomalies, not out of humility, but out of efficiency. An anomaly meant delay, and delay meant attention. The folder opened. Photographs slid into view, aerial shots, boundary lines, a cabin swallowed by trees and snow. Someone said the place had looked abandoned for years. Someone else added that the fence was new. The man's smile thinned. New fences were not obstacles, they were invitations. New fences meant owners who still believed boundaries mattered. He asked for names. None were provided. He asked for witnesses. None worth noting. He nodded, already done with the subject, and assigned 2 men to visit the property, not to negotiate, not to threaten overtly, but to apply pressure in the way pressure had always worked. Presence, implication. the quiet suggestion that leaving now would be easier than staying later. The meeting moved on to other parcels, other signatures, other lives folded into columns, and by the time the coffee cooled, the cabin near Spokane had been reduced to a line item marked pending. While that decision traveled outward, Ethan Walker stood in his cabin and felt the air shift again, the subtle change that came when intent crossed distance. He had unpacked nothing. He had sat with Rex and listened to the wind until the sound of tires earlier had faded into nothing, and when nothing remained, he felt no relief. Silence, he had learned, was often just a pause between moves. He replayed Martha's words without letting them settle into panic, pulling facts free of emotion, the way he'd been trained to pull shrapnel from a wound, fake paperwork, abandoned properties, disappearances dressed as accidents. He had seen versions of this pattern in places where the law wore a uniform and a rifle, where the difference between order and exploitation depended on who controlled the forms. He had promised himself he would not import the war into his leave, and yet here it was, not imported, but homegrown, wearing a respectable suit. Rex lifted his head, as if answering a question Ethan hadn't asked, eyes tracking the invisible lines between trees. Ethan rested his hand against the dog's shoulder, not for comfort, but for calibration. If Rex felt the world tightening, it meant something was already moving. 2 days passed without incident. Snow fell, then stopped. The road remained quiet. Ethan worked the cabin the way he worked his mind, checking, adjusting, refusing to relax into routine. On the third morning, a vehicle approached deliberately, not creeping, not rushing, and stopped at the edge of the drive as if it had always belonged there. 2 men stepped out. They did not wear uniforms. They did not smile. They walked toward the cabin with the confidence of people who believed conversation was a courtesy they could revoke. Ethan met them on the porch because distance was a form of control, and he refused to surrender it. The exchange was brief, polite enough to be insulting. They spoke about records, about properties being reassessed, about how inconvenient it would be to remain when a place had been slated for development. They did not say leave. They implied it. Ethan listened, measured their weight shifts, their eye movements, the way one of them kept glancing toward the tree line, as if checking angles without knowing why. Rex stood behind Ethan, silent, present, a pressure that made one of the men clear his throat. Ethan replied with the truth stripped of explanation. He lived here, the land was his, and he would not be signing anything. The men exchanged a look, the kind that pretended to be patience. One said they would return with documentation. The other added that accidents happened in winter, that snow hid mistakes well. Ethan said nothing. Silence, when used deliberately, could be louder than refusal. They left without raising their voices, without crossing a line that would invite consequence, and as their vehicle disappeared, Ethan felt the click of another mechanism engaging somewhere beyond the trees. He waited. He always waited. When nothing followed, he returned inside and wrote down what he had seen, not because he needed the notes, but because discipline demanded record. That night, far from the cabin, the man with the folder learned that his 2 visitors had not checked in. He did not curse. He did not rush. He reviewed their route, the timing, the weather. He smiled again, this time with interest. A small loss could be absorbed. A pattern could not. He made a call to a different number, one not associated with his company, one that did not appear on any ledger. He spoke fewer words than before, enough to set a different kind of pressure in motion, one that did not knock or negotiate. At the same time, another action unfolded quietly, one designed not for force, but for leverage. A letter was drafted by someone who understood how men like Ethan Walker thought, how they trusted only those who had bled with them, how old bonds could be used as doors when all others stayed closed. The envelope carried no return address. The handwriting was careful, neutral, neither threatening nor pleading. It was sent not to the cabin, but to a different place entirely, a name pulled from records that had once been sealed and were now merely inconvenient. When the letter dropped through the slot of a modest home miles away, it waited like a held breath, confident that the past would answer when called. Back at the cabin, Ethan stood by the window and watched the snow settle into new shapes, aware, without knowing why, that the conflict had stepped into a deeper phase. He felt it not as fear, but as alignment, the moment when scattered signals resolved into a single direction. Rex pressed closer, steady and unflinching. Somewhere beyond the trees, decisions were being made that would soon arrive without warning, and Ethan understood that the next contact would not ask permission, would not announce itself as business, and would not leave without consequence. Evening settles early over the cabin as winter tightens the forest, turning silence into pressure and routine into risk, the kind that arrives before footsteps and leaves after blood. Ethan had begun to trust the rhythm of the place again, which was how he knew something was wrong. Trust, for him, was not comfort, but calibration, the sense that variables were behaving as expected, and tonight the air refused to line up with its own patterns. He stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup that smelled faintly of salt and heat, letting the motion steady his hands while his thoughts circled the last 2 days. The visit from the men had been polite enough to be dangerous, and their disappearance should have brought relief, but instead left a hollow certainty that someone else would move next. He felt that certainty in his bones, the way a storm announced itself before the clouds arrived. Rex lay near the doorway, eyes half-lidded, body relaxed but listening, the way a seasoned sentry conserved energy until the moment demanded everything. Ethan didn't look at the windows. He felt them, felt the way darkness pressed against the glass as if testing it. He thought of Martha's warning and the way she had said the word learning, and he hated how accurate it felt. The soup began to simmer. Steam rose and kissed the window pane, softening the edge of the night. Ethan reached to lower the heat, and that was when Rex lifted his head sharply, not barking, not growling, but freezing with a focus so absolute it cut through the room. Ethan followed the dog's attention and felt his chest tighten. The forest had gone too still. Not the natural pause between gusts, but a silence that erased small sounds, the kind that came when movement synchronized itself to avoid detection. Ethan turned off the stove and stepped back, letting the room cool as if heat itself were a liability. He whispered Rex's name once, a check, not a command, and felt the answer in the dog's posture, danger without confusion. Ethan's mind accelerated, assembling options while discarding fantasies. He moved toward the rifle rack out of reflex, his hand closing around familiar metal, and then he knew before he saw it that something had been altered. The weight was wrong, the balance off. He checked anyway, fingers moving with trained economy, and felt the empty truth of it settle like ice in his stomach. The magazine was gone, not dropped, not misplaced, removed. The realization did not produce panic. It produced clarity sharpened by anger he refused to indulge. Someone had been inside the cabin. Someone had watched him long enough to choose a moment when he believed he was alone. The first impact came from the window, a violent punctuation of glass and sound that turned the night into fragments. Ethan moved without conscious thought, body folding low as he pulled Rex close and rolled behind the heavy table. A second impact followed, then a third, not wild, not frantic, but measured, placed to herd rather than kill. He heard boots on snow, quick and coordinated, and understood that the people outside did not need to see him to know where he would be. They were shaping the space. Ethan felt a flicker of something like admiration for the discipline, then crushed it. Admiration was a luxury. He had no long gun and no intention of charging blind into angles he couldn't read. He had the room, the shadows, and a dog who understood movement as language. He touched Rex's shoulder twice, the signal to circle wide and draw attention without committing. Rex moved instantly, silent as intent, and the sound of paws redirected the focus outside just enough to give Ethan space. He grabbed what he could carry and slid toward the back of the cabin, the one exit that did not funnel him into the trees they would expect. The next blast shook the structure, not enough to collapse it, but enough to announce escalation. Ethan felt heat tear along his side as something found him through wood and air, a clean, punishing line that stole breath and left fire in its place. He did not scream. He did not slow. Pain became information, telling him what still worked and what did not. He kicked open the rear door and threw himself into the snow, rolling to extinguish momentum, listening for the change in sound that would mean pursuit had broken formation. Rex reappeared at his side as if summoned by gravity, pressing close, anchoring him with a presence that said, "Stay alive first, win later." Ethan crawled until the cabin was between him and the shooters, then forced himself upright and moved along the tree line, using the darkness as cover and the storm as eraser. The world narrowed to breath footfall and the distance between heartbeats. He could hear voices now, clipped and professional, calling angles and timing, not names. This wasn't intimidation, this was removal. He slipped into a shallow depression he'd marked weeks ago and waited, counting steps he could not see, trusting the forest to carry sound unevenly. Another shot cracked too close, and bark exploded from a trunk inches from his face. Ethan returned nothing. He wasn't here to trade. He was here to survive. He waited for the moment when discipline became impatience, when a hunter assumed the wounded prey would run. When it came, he moved, breaking left into deeper snow, dragging Rex with him until the trees thickened and the angles collapsed into confusion. A flash behind him told him they had shifted to lighting the ground, and he smiled grimly at the waste. Light revealed as much as it hid. He made distance the way he had been taught, not straight, not fast, but deliberate, letting the storm do the work of erasing his trail. By the time the forest swallowed the cabin completely, Ethan's breath came ragged and metallic, and the pain in his side had become a heavy insistence that threatened to pull him down. He leaned into a trunk and slid until he was seated, snow soaking through his clothes, and pressed his hand hard against the wound, counting until the edges of the world stopped vibrating. Rex stayed pressed against him, sharing warmth without demand, eyes scanning, ears reading the dark. Ethan laughed once, quietly, a sound stripped of humor because the absurdity of it cut through the fear. He had come home for quiet and found himself hunted by men who believed paperwork made violence legitimate. He forced himself to stand again. Stopping meant dying later. He moved away from the cabin without looking back, choosing a direction that would take him toward roads he could disappear on and people who would not ask questions until he needed them to. Somewhere behind him, the men would be checking the cabin, confirming the absence of a body, reporting partial success to someone who would translate it into the next instruction. Ethan focused on Rex's steady presence and the simple, brutal arithmetic of survival. He did not know yet how his rifle had been disarmed or how deep the compromise ran, only that it existed and that it had cost him blood. As the storm closed ranks behind him, swallowing sound and light, Ethan understood that the attack was not an end, but a message, and the message was clear enough to carry through pain. They were done asking. Night thins into a gray, uncertain dawn as the storm loosens its grip, leaving the road slick and quiet, the kind of quiet that hides consequences and invites decisions that cannot be undone. Ethan did not remember choosing the direction, only the act of moving, of putting one step ahead of the other, because stopping felt like permission to disappear. The pain in his side had settled into something dense and consuming, a weight that dragged at his balance and narrowed his vision until the world existed in fragments. The crunch of snow, the hiss of breath, the steady presence of Rex close enough to touch without looking. He knew better than to chase comfort, but he chased continuity, the thin thread that said, if he kept going, something would still make sense. The forest gave way to road, and the road gave way to a shape he recognized before he could name it. A modest house set back from the street with lights still burning despite the hour, as if its owner understood that some nights refused to end politely. Ethan reached the steps on Will alone and knocked once, hard enough to be heard. Then the strength left him all at once, and he slid down the doorframe, the cold biting through his clothes as if to keep him awake. Rex stood over him, a barrier made of intent, ears forward, body angled toward the dark, guarding what remained. The door opened on a face Ethan had not expected to see again outside of memory, a man whose life had been stitched together by triage tents and field hospitals, a man who had learned to read damage quickly because hesitation cost lives. The doctor did not shout. He did not ask questions. He knelt, assessed, and spoke a single instruction to the night to wait. Inside, under a light that was too bright and too kind, Ethan drifted in and out, while practiced hands worked with quiet urgency, pressure applied where it mattered, blood stopped because blood could be stopped, pain acknowledged only as data. He caught pieces of conversation as if they were flares rising and falling. Lucky, clean through, don't move, none of it comforting, all of it necessary. When his eyes opened again, the room had changed from emergency to aftermath, the kind that invited thought to rush back in with accusations and demands. Rex lay nearby, still, vigilant, a living perimeter that allowed Ethan to breathe without checking the door. The doctor sat opposite him, not hovering, not retreating, holding a mug that had long since gone cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried something heavier than concern. He said there had been a letter. It had arrived the night before, slipped through the mail slot without ceremony, addressed carefully, not in threat, but in assumption. No return address, no signature, just a sentence that had set his teeth on edge. If you still remember the man who saved your life, keep your door unlocked tonight. Ethan closed his eyes, understanding blooming with a bitter clarity that cut through the lingering haze. They had traced him backward through loyalty, through the bonds that didn't show up on any ledger, through the people who would open a door without asking why. The doctor admitted he had debated ignoring it, had argued with himself that paranoia was a habit best resisted, but the wording had been too precise, too intimate, like someone knocking from the inside of a shared past. He had left the door unlocked anyway, not out of fear, but because he recognized the tactic and refused to be ruled by it. Ethan absorbed that quietly, anger tightening his chest, not toward the doctor but toward himself, for believing distance equaled safety. The phone rang while the understanding was still settling, a sound that cut through the room with surgical efficiency. The doctor glanced at the screen, then at Ethan, and answered on speaker without ceremony, because ceremony would only lie about what was happening. The voice on the other end was calm, almost courteous, the way people sounded when they believed they were already winning. It spoke about concern, about inconvenience, about how unfortunate it was when property disputes escalated. Then it mentioned Martha, not by name but by detail, enough to remove doubt, enough to pull the floor out from under the conversation. It said she was safe for now. It said safety was conditional. It said there would be a place and a time to resolve matters like adults, and it offered coordinates as if offering a compromise. Ethan listened without interrupting, his face empty, his mind working fast and cold, mapping leverage against probability, calculating cost. When the call ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm had. The doctor watched him with the look of someone who had seen too many men choose the path that hurt them because it spared others, and said quietly that Ethan wasn't fit, that he could make calls, that there were options that didn't involve walking into a room designed to close behind him. Ethan shook his head once. He did not explain that there were fewer options than the doctor imagined, that delay would not buy mercy, that Martha's life had been turned into a clock. He asked for gauze, for tape, for something to dull the pain enough to stand without blacking out. The doctor handed them over because he understood what refusal would mean. Before Ethan left, the doctor said one more thing, not as advice, but as fact. The letter had been written by someone who knew exactly how Ethan thought, and that meant the compromise was deeper than the men in the snow. Ethan nodded because denial would have been a waste of time. Outside, the air tasted like metal and mourning, and Ethan felt the weight of what he was about to do settle into place with an odd calm. Rex rose at once, pressed close, a wordless agreement to whatever came next. As they moved toward the road, Ethan considered the narrow line he was about to walk, the difference between surrender and strategy, between giving something up and taking something back. He did not know yet how the night had reached inside his cabin to strip his rifle, but he knew enough to trust no assumption and to treat every kindness as potentially compromised. The coordinates burned into his mind as he drove, each mile a quiet negotiation with pain, each breath a promise to arrive standing. He thought of Martha's face in the street, of the child's mittens swinging, of the way silence had protected predators more than any weapon ever could. By the time the city reappeared at the edge of his vision, Ethan had made his decision, and it felt less like courage than inevitability. The next room he entered would be lit too brightly and arranged too neatly, and someone there would believe a signature could end a life cleanly. Ethan intended to test that belief, even if it meant paying for the lesson in blood. A vacant office on Spokane's edge glows too clean under winter lights, its warmth artificial, its order deliberate, a place prepared for signatures rather than mercy. Ethan parked where the snow had been plowed into neat walls and left the engine running for a count he used to steady his pulse, not because he needed courage, but because he needed precision, and precision began with control over breath. The building looked abandoned only in the way predators like their traps to look, lights on, doors unlocked, nothing visibly broken, an invitation dressed as neglect. He stepped inside alone, hands empty and visible, feeling the pull of the wound in his side with every movement, pain thick and insistent, but contained, a problem to manage later. Rex did not enter at first. Ethan paused, met the dog's eyes, and held them there long enough to pass a decision without sound, the agreement that Rex would wait until called, the kind of trust that did not need reassurance. The lobby opened into a conference room arranged with a careful neutrality that made Ethan's skin prickle, a long table centered beneath bright panels, chairs aligned, a document laid out with a pen placed just so, like a still life designed to convince the viewer that nothing unexpected ever happened here. Martha sat opposite, bound to a chair, her mouth taped, her eyes wide and shining with fear that felt real enough to twist something deep in Ethan's chest. He forced himself to look away before the pull could change his plan. The man who stepped from the side door did not announce himself and did not smile, and Ethan recognized the type instantly, the calm that came from never being forced to act quickly. He spoke about resolution and ownership, about how winter made accidents believable, about how adults solved problems with paperwork rather than noise, and he slid the document closer with 2 fingers as if pushing a cup of coffee across a table. Ethan read without rushing, every clause a familiar lie polished until it passed for truth, the land transferred, the dispute ended, the future simplified into clean margins. He thought of the men at the fence, of the empty magazine, of the letter sent to a door that should have been safe, and felt the weight of the trap settle fully into place. This was not about land, it was about teaching compliance by demonstrating leverage. The man watched him with an expression that suggested patience but concealed appetite, waiting for the moment when fear would present itself as reason. Ethan picked up the pen, felt its cheap balance between his fingers, and signed his name in a hand that wavered just enough to sell the story, not because he doubted the decision, but because he wanted them to believe he did. The pen returned to the table, the document gathered, the man's relief brief and dangerous. He reached for a pistol with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to consequences arriving late, and the room tilted as the choice Ethan had already made advance to its next step. The lights went out. Darkness fell absolute and immediate, not the soft dim of an outage, but the hard cut of a switch pulled with intent, and in that instant Rex burst through the doorway with the force of a promise kept, a low, ferocious sound tearing the order apart as confusion replaced choreography. Ethan moved at the same time, not toward the gun but toward the space between threats, overturning a chair, driving the table to create angles that didn't exist a second earlier, using noise to steal seconds and seconds to steal ground. The pistol fired once into the dark, the report concussive, the smell sharp, and Ethan felt the heat of it pass close enough to remind him how thin the margin was. He found Martha by memory and touch, cut the bindings with a blade he had kept hidden because he had learned long ago that the last weapon was the one no one searched for, and pulled her free even as bodies collided nearby, curses and commands tangling as the room lost its geometry. Rex reappeared like a line drawn through chaos, intercepting movement, forcing men to hesitate, and hesitation was the currency Ethan spent with ruthless care. He drove one attacker into the wall, felt bone give under controlled force, redirected another into the spill of light from a cracked door, and for a moment believed the worst of it had passed. That was when the pain in his side flared white, and his balance betrayed him, and in the fraction of a second when he adjusted, a blade found its way home. The sensation was oddly distant at first, a pressure more than a cut, then heat, then a spreading weakness that tried to pull him down. He tightened his grip on Martha and forced himself upright, pushing through the narrowing tunnel of his vision while the room continued to unravel, men slipping on overturned furniture, the sound of alarms beginning somewhere too late to matter. He heard the man who had offered the pen shout something sharp and panicked, a voice stripped of authority by darkness, and Ethan answered by tearing the document in half and letting the pieces fall where signatures were supposed to end arguments. The lights flickered once, twice, threatening to restore order, and Ethan dragged Martha toward the exit, Rex flanking them with relentless focus, turning pursuit into avoidance, buying the last seconds they needed. They burst into the cold, and the night swallowed the noise, snow absorbing sound as efficiently as it hid blood. Ethan felt the knife wound finally assert itself with brutal clarity, felt his legs threaten to fold, and caught himself on the doorframe long enough to shove Martha forward, long enough to believe he had done the thing he came to do. A figure surged behind them, and Ethan turned on instinct alone, too slow now, too tired to be elegant, and the blade flashed again, a promise he could not fully dodge. He went down to one knee, breath torn from him, and in that kneeling moment he understood. The lie at the center of the room he had just escaped. Signatures never ended violence, they only delayed who paid for it. Rex's presence closed in, solid and unyielding, a wall made of loyalty. And Ethan let the darkness creep closer at the edges as sirens rose somewhere far off, too distant to be rescue, close enough to be consequence. He did not know yet what would be revealed when the lights came back on, or who had truly turned the switch, only that the choice he had made inside that bright room had carried him through the trap and into something sharper, something that would not wait for daylight. Sirens brayed with winter air outside the vacant office as snow dulls sound and light, turning the parking lot into a cold ledger where choices are totaled and debts are called in. Ethan felt the world tilt as he knelt in the snow, breath sawn into short metallic pulls by the knife wound that burned and then numbed. The kind of pain that tried to bargain for surrender with dizziness and darkness, and he would have accepted the bargain if Rex had not pressed in close with the unyielding insistence that staying conscious mattered more than comfort. He kept his eyes open because closing them invited memory to rush in unchecked, and memory was heavier than blood loss. Martha was in front of him, free now, her wrists raw where the bindings had been, her hands shaking as if they belonged to someone else. And for a heartbeat, Ethan believed the story he had chosen to believe inside the bright room, that the exchange had worked, that the cost had been paid, that the worst of it was behind them. The belief lasted exactly as long as it took for her breathing to change. It wasn't relief he heard, it was calculation, the quiet recalibration of someone realizing the room had rearranged itself without permission. She spoke his name softly, not to soothe but to test whether he was still reachable, and when he looked up he saw not fear, but impatience, the kind that surfaced when a plan slipped and demanded correction. She told him there was no point pretending anymore, that the money had been too large and the promises too precise, that survival had offered her a bargain she could not refuse because she had already learned what refusal cost. Ethan understood then with a clarity that cut cleaner than the blade had, understood the empty magazine, the letter sent to a door that should have been safe, the timing that placed the ambush exactly where it would hurt without killing, understood that the compromise had not been an accident, but an alignment, a decision made in advance and paid for with his trust. He felt no surge of rage, no cinematic collapse, only a cold settling that stripped the moment of noise and left him with work to do. Martha kept talking, explaining as if explanation might soften consequence, explaining how information moved and how men in suits never dirtied their hands, how paperwork made violence polite, and Ethan listened because listening bought seconds, and seconds were currency. Rex shifted, placing himself between Ethan and the nearest shadow with a presence that dared anyone to test it, and the simple geometry of that loyalty steadied Ethan's hand as he reached for the last measure he had not surrendered. He pulled the pin with the economy of someone who had done it before and never wanted to again, rolled the weight into the space where confidence had pooled moments earlier, and wrapped an arm around Rex without drama, because drama wasted time, and time was now the only mercy he could offer. He did not look at Martha when he moved, not out of cruelty, but because the act required precision rather than judgment, and he launched himself toward the low wall at the edge of the lot, as the explosion folded the night inward, pressure hammering air and snow into a concussive promise that this chapter would not be negotiated. They landed hard, Ethan's shoulder slamming first, the impact tearing a sound from him he did not recognize as his own, and then they were rolling into darkness as alarms shrieked and glass sang, and the building's certainty collapsed into smoke and shouting. He crawled because standing was a lie, dragged himself because stopping would be interpreted as permission, and Rex matched him without question, a living argument against surrender. The sirens grew teeth as they closed the distance, and with them came the unmistakable cadence of coordination, radios snapping to life, voices calling positions that were not guesses. Federal agents poured into the lot with practiced urgency, weapons angled, commands clipped, and for a moment Ethan considered lifting his head to explain, to claim the narrative before it claimed him. But the habit died before it could stand. A man stepped into his field of vision and said his name with recognition rather than accusation, a professional courtesy that acknowledged history without exploiting it. And Ethan shook his head once, not in denial, but in refusal. He did not give a name, he gave compliance, hands visible, body still. The work was done. They moved past him to secure the wreckage, to collect men who had believed signatures could buy endings, to separate Martha from the story she had sold herself into, and Ethan watched her face empty as the bargain's fine print arrived with cuffs and cameras and consequences that did not care how persuasive she sounded. The agents worked with the efficiency of people who understood scale, who saw this not as an isolated incident, but as a node in a network, and Ethan recognized the relief in that, the way law could be slow but thorough when finally given enough light. A medic knelt beside him and asked questions designed to keep him here, and Ethan answered because Rex stayed pressed to his side and because the snow felt less cold now that the shouting had a direction. Later, much later, when the night had been reduced to reports and evidence bags and a controlled perimeter, someone told him the arrests were wide and immediate, that documents would unravel into trails, that the ledger would finally be balanced by something other than fear. He nodded without satisfaction. Satisfaction was for people who believed violence ended things. As dawn thinned the dark, news vans gathered at a respectful distance, hungry for a face to anchor the story, and Ethan turned away from the lights because anonymity was not humility, it was strategy. He signed nothing, said little, and when asked for identification, he offered what he had always been most comfortable being, a witness without a spotlight. By the time the snow began to fall again, soft and straight, as if winter had decided to behave, Ethan and Rex were already leaving, guided by a quiet agreement that survival did not require applause. He felt the wound pulse and then settle into a manageable throb, felt the exhaustion arrive without collapse, and understood at last what the long war had tried to teach him and failed. Peace was not the absence of threat, but the discipline to choose restraint when force begged to be simple. He did not forgive Martha because forgiveness was not a currency he carried, but he released the weight of her choice from his own ledger and let it fall where it belonged. As the road opened ahead and the sirens faded into ordinary distance, Ethan rested his hand against Rex and allowed the quiet to exist without suspicion for the first time since returning, not because the world had become safe, but because he had finished deciding who he would be when it was not. Sometimes the miracle is not fire from the sky, but restraint in the heart. God does not always save us by removing danger. Sometimes God saves us by giving us the strength to choose what is right when violence would be easier. In the darkest winter, when betrayal cuts deeper than any blade, faith becomes the quiet voice that says, "Stay human, even when the world forgets how." In our daily lives, we may never face gunfire or storms of snow, but we all face moments where fear, anger, or greed ask us to surrender our values. And in those moments, the greatest miracle is choosing love over hate, discipline over revenge, and truth over comfort. As Scripture reminds us, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. God works not only through victory, but through endurance. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles hidden in ordinary lives. And may God bless you, protect your home, guide your choices, and give you peace in every season of your journey.